Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason in Theology. Your host Michael, joined by Father Deacon Anthony Dragani, and we are going to be talking about Pope Francis and his Canada visit and whether or not he participated in a pagan and idolatrous ceremony. But before we dive in, welcome back to the show, Father Deacon. How are you?
Fantastic, Michael. Happy to be here.
Always great to have you on. You know, I learn every time from you whenever you go over similar instances. We did a video on Pachamama not long ago, a few months ago, and a whole bunch of people really benefited from it, including myself, because what you did is you went through the ceremony, walked us through it play by play, and explained what was going on. And so for those who haven't seen it, go and check it out. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But I'm looking forward to this one because this has also caused quite a stir. The ceremony that Pope Francis participated in, pretty sure it was just last year, 2022. I don't
Yes,
think
it was in July of 2022.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember when this came out, and it was certainly confusing. And I was watching this thinking, this is odd, and they're praying to these circle of spirits, and it's like, what in the world is going on? It just seems very, it just seems very pagan and even scandalous in nature. And so I certainly had a whole lot of questions about it, and I spoke to you about it, and you were able to give me some really helpful insights into it. And so that's what I want to do today, is for you to kind of maybe walk us through the ceremony. I know you have a video of it. Maybe walk us through the video play by play, explain it to us. Let's go over the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Sounds perfect. Let's do it.
All right. And if you pull it up on your screen, I can enable it on my side over here.
Before I start with the video, I want to tell a story.
Oh yeah, okay.
A story first. So to understand what took place here, we need some context. I'm going to give a bit of historical context and then some context leading up to the event itself.
Okay.
So, as most of your viewers are probably aware, French missionaries played a huge role in Canada, especially in reaching the indigenous population. And when these French missionaries arrived there, many of whom were Jesuit, for example, they worked on enculturation with the Native Americans. And they did that by showing how many of their existing beliefs and practices lined up with Catholicism. So they evangelized the indigenous people, they baptized them, they taught them the Catholic faith, but they also showed them how their culture was in complete harmony with Catholicism in most ways. And things that may have been associated with nature worship at one point took on a new Catholic meaning. So for about 200 years, you had a situation among the indigenous people of Canada where they were very Catholic and very indigenous. They would do things like a smudge, which I'll explain later, or prayer to the four directions, which I'll explain later. While at the same time, praying the rosary, going to mass, and being very devout, faithful Catholics. There was no problem there. And as a matter of fact, the missionaries helped them to preserve many of their cultural traditions by creating alphabets for them, for their languages. So at that point in time, Catholicism and the indigenous culture were in beautiful harmony with each other. This got ruined in the early 1900s. What happened was this: the federal government of Canada decided that it could not tolerate different cultures coexisting in Canada. So they created what was called the residential school system. And this was a means to try and assimilate indigenous peoples into what they saw as a mainstream Canadian culture. They wanted to wipe out the cultural aspects of the indigenous peoples. So this initially came from the federal government of Canada, but they recruited churches to run these schools. So some of the schools were run by the Catholic Church, most of them were, but some were run by the Anglicans, others were run by, I think, Methodists. A whole variety of religious groups ran these schools. But the schools were given the directive to try and eliminate aspects of their former culture and give them the Canadian culture, which was basically, a British French culture. Now, the Catholic Church went along with this, perhaps naively at first, but at a certain point, many Catholic religious orders and dioceses were cooperating with this. The big problem, though, the huge problem with this was that this was not a voluntary thing. Indigenous children were taken from their parents by force, sent to these residential schools where in many cases they never saw their parents again, or they were told their parents didn't want them anymore. And they were raised there and cut off entirely from their native culture, and in many cases cut off from their families. This was a huge problem. Now, the system came to an end a while ago. I think the last residential school closed down in the 1990s, I believe. But the problem that left was huge, which was Native Americans who felt cut off from their culture, who felt betrayed by the government, and felt betrayed by the church. Because again, most of them were faithful Catholics, but the church cooperated in this. And in some cases, the schools they were sent to had abusive practices, whether it was sexual abuse or emotional abuse. It was bad. So a whole generation of Native Americans kind of several generations lost their language, they lost their culture. It created a lot of bitterness. Now, things kind of reached ahead in the 1990s when the last school shut down, but this whole thing resurfaced in 2001. 2001, there was the discovery of possible mass graves behind schools.
It's starting to sound muffled, by the way. You were coming in loud and clear. Now it's sounding muffled for some reason.
How does it sound now?
Now it's better. Okay.
I'm not sure what's going on. Let me just check real quick the wires.
Yeah. Maybe it's a signal issue, like Wi-Fi. But no, because your video is coming through clear. So
all right, how is the audio now?
Coming through well now. So let's try to move forward. So you're talking about it in 2001. That's the last thing that I was able to understand.
Okay.
So you're talking about I think 2001 things came to a head in the 90s, and then something happened in 2001.
2000. Sorry, I meant 2021.
Gotcha.
All right. Is the audio good now?
Mm-hmm.
If it muffles again, let me know, and I'll see what I can do to fix it.
Okay.
I hate technical things.
Yeah, I know.
You can't control these gremlins, right?
Right. Yeah.
So in 2021, things kind of resurfaced when there was a discovery of what appeared to possibly be mass graves behind some of the residential schools, behind the old buildings. And the belief was that these were mass graves of Native American children.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at the time, I don't think this could be conclusively substantiated. The last articles I saw on this didn't seem to have a conclusion either. It's possible they were. If these were unmarked graves of Native American children, or indigenous children, as they're called in Canada, First Nation, if these were unmarked graves of indigenous children, part of the explanation could be that there were several very horrid pandemics that came through, like in the 1920s and 30s, that killed a lot of children in general. And in some cases, these pandemics could have killed so many people that they ran out of, coffins and graves. That happened locally where I live during the Spanish flu. They had a mass grave in my current area because they ran out of, prepared graves, ran out of coffins.
Wow.
So the point is, though, that the feeling was that these were kids who were forgotten, who were lost, and who were mistreated. And there were at least 200 children who were taken as part of the residential system and never were heard from again. No one knows whatever happened to them. So when this happened, it created a great deal of pain in the indigenous community, rightfully so. And in the beginning of 2022, a group of Native American elders traveled to Rome to meet with the Holy Father to discuss this. And there the Holy Father expressed his great sorrow. And then later on, he said he had a desire to come to Canada to meet with the Native Americans and to formally apologize. And by the way, I want to put out a little apology here. I'm going to be referring to them a lot as Native Americans. I know in Canada, they tend to use language like indigenous people or First Nation. It's just force of habit on my end.
Sure.
So anyway, so that's what prompted this visit. So in July of 2022, Pope Francis came to Canada to connect with the Native American population, but also to apologize for what happened. but he purposely timed it for July to coincide with the feast of St. Anne. Now, here's why this is important. When the Catholic missionaries arrived in Canada, hundreds of years ago, one thing they realized is that the Native American people, the indigenous people, have a tremendous love and respect for their elders, especially grandparents. And among many of the indigenous peoples of Canada, grandmothers in particular were held in reverence as being sources of great wisdom. So when they introduced these people to St. Anne, they felt an affinity for her. And many of the indigenous nations adopted St. Anne as their patron. So St. Anne, the grandmother of Jesus, still has a place of tremendous reverence for the indigenous people. And so the Pope decided that he would coincide his visit with the Feast of St. Anne for that reason, to show that that connection was still there. And they laid out the trip very carefully. It would begin with a pilgrimage to a shrine of St. Anne and end with a pilgrimage to another shrine of St. Anne. So it would begin and end with St. Anne. So like on the first day, I believe the first pilgrimage site he went to was a shrine to St. Anne located on the lake of St. Anne. It's a lake named after St. Anne that's believed to have healing properties. This is an interesting thing. Before the Catholic missionaries arrived, the indigenous people believed that that lake had healing properties. They saw it as a sacred place. And when the missionaries arrived, the natives began to associate it with St. Anne, and it became the Lake of St. Anne, and is still a pilgrimage place. So when Pope Francis arrived at that pilgrimage site, when he did the blessing with water, where he was sprinkling with holy water, he was actually using holy water from that lake.
Was aware of that.
Yeah. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. And I'm going to have some twists and turns here. You ready?
I'm ready to go. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So when they're planning this event, they wanted to make sure that the pilgrimage went off without a hitch. And they picked a priest who would be in charge of all liturgical celebrations for the entire week. And they made a very interesting choice. They picked a priest named Father Cristino Bovet. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name. My French is very rusty. I took my PhD program, I took French for research. So I learned to read French, but I didn't learn to necessarily speak it correctly. So, but I believe it's pronounced Cristino Bovet. Now, Father Cristino is himself an indigenous person. He's from a indigenous nation. He was raised, practicing their culture and also practicing the Catholic faith simultaneously. He still does both. He still fully celebrates and practices his culture, and he still is a devout and very faithful Catholic priest. He's a younger priest, I'd guess in maybe his 30s, 40s at the latest. But he's an interesting guy. I've seen a number of his videos and lectures, really worth listening to, because he himself is a very proud indigenous person, but he's also a very faithful Catholic and a very theologically orthodox Catholic. Like, his theology is very sound, very traditional, nothing loopy, nothing new age. Actually, I listened to a talk he gave in which he made a very strong case for ad orientem worship. And he's a big believer in not experimenting with liturgy. He always says, I've heard multiple talks of his where he talks about the importance of following the rubrics and following, the mind of the church and not messing with it. He's not a fan of liturgical experimentation. But they picked him to be the one to oversee all of this, probably because he is himself an indigenous person, but also he's known for having an expertise in things like liturgy. And again, he reflects a very traditional bent. One of the things, too, that the Vatican discussed with him was there was a mutual desire on the part of Father Cristino and on the Vatican officials, a mutual desire to not have Pope Francis participate in any ceremonies that require explanation.
I didn't want him to participate.
No.
Repeat that.
Is my microphone fading out again?
I didn't hear that last part.
I'm sorry. Is the microphone still misfunctioning?
No, it sounds good. It sounds good.
Both the Vatican and Father Cristino did not want the Holy Father to participate in any ceremonies that would require an explanation.
I wonder what the logic is behind that.
Okay, so Father Cristino discussed this in an interview that he gave.
Hmm.
And he actually gave an interview after the pilgrimage was over, in which he talked about what happened behind the scenes. It was a pretty telling interview. But the logic was this: if there was a ceremony, an indigenous ceremony that Pope Francis participated in, that would require catechesis for people not to think that it was pagan or that it was witchcraft, they chose not to have him engage in it, because even if the ceremony was perfectly sound, done in harmony with Catholicism, if
Hmm.
it can be taken out of context, shown on a TV screen as an example of the Pope engaging idolatry, they felt that could do more harm than good.
But his presence there still could raise some concerns, right?
No, the idea was he wouldn't be even attending anything that required
He
explanation.
he wouldn't be at all there.
No,
Got it.
if there was a
Got it.
ceremony that required any kind of explanation, he would not be there.
He wouldn't be the present. Got it.
Right.
Okay.
So, for
Mhm.
example, they discussed, whether or not to have things like a smudging.
Got it.
For those who aren't familiar with it, a smudging is it's a ritual of purification. Usually it involves burning sage. Now, in Canada, they usually use sweetgrass because it grows around the Great Lakes. But you burn something that smells good, and it's a plant. And the idea is that when the plant is burning, you're returning it to God. The plant came
Mhm.
from God, you're returning it to God.
Hmm.
But it's seen as a purification in the sense that it prepares you for what's coming next.
Hmm.
So perhaps there's going to be a mass. They may have a purification ritual, a smudging before the mass begins, as a way of preparing themselves to get in the right spiritual and mental state to participate in the mass. In Native American communities, this is very common.
Mhm.
So the smudging in and of itself is not an act of worship. It's not like offering incense. It's not seen as an offering to a god or a deity. What it's seen as a purification to prepare you for what's coming next.
Mhm.
So they decided that Pope Francis would not be present for a smudging ceremony, for example.
Mhm.
They had one at one of the churches of St. Anne, but it was done by the native peoples, I believe, before the Pope even arrived, because they wanted to be in the right mental state to greet the Pope.
Mhm.
Now, we have to understand, too, in Native American cultures, smudging is often a way of preparing for the arrival of an important guest. It's almost like if you're having company over and you know that your wet dog, has been running around the house, you take
Mhm.
some Febreze and start spraying it on furniture.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
It's really the same kind of thing. It's not seen as inherently religious. It's seen as a preparation,
Mhm.
because on one hand, it makes things smell good, but on the other hand, it does show that you're getting in the right state. And
Mhm.
then usually a prayer or something follows after that. But they chose not to have him seen on camera doing anything like that because of the confusion that it could cause. Now you're
Is
probably wondering, well, how did he end up doing this, right?
Well, I'm wondering, are they doing that because of the confusion that a lot of people had with the Pachamama ceremony?
I imagine that's the reason,
Mm, that
because
makes
this was
sense.
forefront on their minds.
Yeah.
And Father Cristino himself opposes the idea of incorporating indigenous rituals into the mass itself
Mhm.
unless it fits in seamlessly.
Mhm.
He's not a fan of taking indigenous rituals that he grew up with, that he still practices,
Mhm.
and imposing a different meaning on them to make them fit into the mass. He doesn't
Mhm.
like that. He actually feels these rituals have more of a paraliturgical role than a role within the mass.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, that's Father Cristino's philosophy. And again, I agree with him. I mean, if you get a chance, watch an interview with him, listen to a video of his, he's pretty fantastic. He has the right approach to this, in my opinion. So he was
Yeah.
planning all of this out, and they had it all worked out very carefully to create a wonderful experience in which Pope Francis would engage with the Native Americans, and he would apologize and hopefully solidify that ages-old bond between the Indigenous people of Canada and
Mhm.
the Church, the Catholic Church. That was the plan. The way that Father Cristino did work in, though, Indigenous culture is in ways other than the actual Mass itself, than changing the rubrics of the Mass or whatnot.
Mhm.
So, for instance, there was Native American music during the
Mhm.
Masses that the Pope celebrated, but music again that was in harmony with the Catholic faith. Uh, so, for the one papal Mass that was a big outdoor stadium Mass, they had 4 deacons for that, and 3 of the deacons were indigenous people, like Father Cristino. So they had 3 deacons for that who were indigenous people. Most of the readers were indigenous people. Rather than focusing on forcing indigenous rituals into the Mass, they incorporated indigenous people into the participation of the Mass. And the vestments worn by the Holy Father and the concelebrants were designed by a Native American designer. Great way to approach it, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
So now it's time for when things get off the rails.
Mm.
Because as you'd imagine, things got off the rails, didn't they?
Oh yeah, I remember that. I mean,
What did you hear?
I was very confused. I mean, I pulled up. I mean, just heard all kinds of things that he's participating in, idolatry and stuff like that. And I thought, I don't think it's idolatry, but let me go and watch this ceremony. And I watched it and I was confused. Like, I don't see anything Christian about this. It seems very pagan. Why would he do this? And it seems very scandalous to be present in this. I know he didn't take an active role, but it's like at the time I wondered, why would he even be present for this?
I have an explanation for you.
Mm-hmm.
He was blindsided.
Huh.
This was sprung on him without warning.
So that wasn't this ceremony was not planned.
Here's what the agenda included. Mm-hmm. So there were 2 masses scheduled. There were a number of public appearances, prayer services, vespers. All this was scheduled, carefully orchestrated and rehearsed by Father Cristino. Mm-hmm. But there was one event they had no control over, which was Pope Francis was invited to be a guest of the Governor General of Canada as head of state. Mm-hmm. So for those who aren't familiar with the Canadian system, the Queen of England at the time, Queen Elizabeth, now it's King Charles, but the monarch of England is also the ruler of Canada. Mm-hmm. And the way that the monarch exercises his or her power is through a Governor General who serves as their representative in Canada. So you have a prime minister, Justin Trudeau, but you also have the Governor General. In this case, her name is Mary Simon, who herself is an indigenous person. She's Inuit. And she invited Pope Francis as head of state to her residence to have a meeting. Now, the meeting was not open to the public, but certain people were invited. It turned out it was televised. Mm-hmm. Again, not a problem. But as far as the Holy Father was aware, as far as Father Cristino was aware, it was going to be a state event with no liturgical aspect whatsoever. So that's what they thought they were going to. Now, Father Cristino figured, okay, I'm off duty right now because I don't have to be there. There's no liturgy I have to supervise. So Father Cristino went to the church where they're going to have the Mass the following morning to rehearse for the Mass to make sure it went off seamlessly, right? So Father Cristino, the head of all liturgical celebrations for this pilgrimage, is at the church preparing for the Mass tomorrow morning because he knows that there's no liturgy. Mm-hmm. And this wasn't a liturgical event. What it was Pope Francis being welcomed as head of state by another head of state, in this case, the Governor General. Mm-hmm. This was a state affair. What Father Cristino did not know, what the Vatican entourage did not know, what the Holy Father did not know, was that they were going to have a welcome performed by a Native American elder. Mm-hmm. And the welcome itself would include elements of smudging as well as a prayer in the 4 directions. Mm-hmm. Now, again, those services in and of themselves, those rituals in and of themselves, smudging and prayer in the 4 directions, there's nothing inherently incompatible with Catholicism in those rituals. And they can be performed by Catholics in a very Catholic way. The problem, though, is some people can do them in other ways. I mean, it's like anything. You can have a Catholic Christian, swinging incense in the direction of a statue and laying flowers on a statue, intending to show devotion to Mary, ultimately to God. You could have another person, waving around incense in front of a statue, intending to worship that statue as a god. Mm-hmm. The same thing can happen with these ceremonies. Originally, these ceremonies or these rituals, such as the smudge or the prayer in the 4 directions, they probably had a spiritual connotation that was non-Christian. Native Americans, indigenous people are historically animistic, which means they worship nature. They don't worship gods or deities, but they worship nature. So these things can be used for that purpose, but again, they can be done in a way that's completely not a problem. Now, in this case, I'll show you the video of what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that the Vatican had no warning this was coming. They had no preparation for it. It was sprung on them, and they were all blindsided. And when it actually happened, the papal representatives who were present and the Holy Father didn't know what to do. They didn't really know what was going on even, so they just tried to be courteous and go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to be courteous because they were there as guests in somebody's house.
And he's there as head of state. So it's not like he's there as Pope with, Catholics participating in a Catholic liturgical ceremony.
Correct.
He's there as head of state for somebody else's, welcome service, if you will, or
this was a welcome, is what it was. It was meant to be a welcome, and
for a government. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and again, the person hosting the welcome, Mary Simon, is herself an indigenous person.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point of the visit was to kind of, reconcile with the indigenous population.
Mm-hmm.
So they thought it'd be nice to have a Native American elder there to welcome the Pope in a traditional Native American way. There was no ill intention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There was no ill intention. So the person that they invited to do this is a Native American elder from and again, excuse my mispronunciations, from the Huron-Wendat Nation. The Huron-Wendat Nation is, an indigenous nation located very close to Quebec City.
Okay.
And the gentleman they invited, his name is Raymond Gros-Louis. Again, I probably mispronounced it, but I'll stick with that. Raymond Gros-Louis. He himself is considered an elder.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't find a whole lot on him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I did find is there's an official webpage for the Huron-Wendat Nation, and they have listed on there something called the Circle of Elders.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a list of their leaders under the Circle of Elders. And there's a description there, and it says the Circle of Elders are composed of individuals who are leaders in our community, who've proven willing to help others, who are willing to pass on our traditions. That's what the description is. Mm-hmm. Now, this is all in French. In French, what it says at the top is not Circle of Elders, but something along the lines of Circle of Sages.
Okay.
Because Circle of Sages, translated into English, is Circle of Elders. But many people on the web saw this. They looked him up. They found this webpage. He's a sage. He must be a witch doctor. He's a pagan, magician of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
They really played that up, sage, right? But what it means is simply he's an elder. He's part of the Circle of Elders of this nation. And what he was doing there wasn't even a religious ritual. It was a welcome ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's one way of looking at it. I'm going to have it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Here's one way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we're having an official state event.
Mm-hmm.
We may have something along the lines of a Pledge of Allegiance or singing the national anthem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at the Pledge of Allegiance, putting the hand on over the heart, saying those words, or same thing with singing the national anthem. For people who aren't familiar with it, it could seem kind of strange. What are you doing? Are you worshiping that flag?
Yeah.
Are you singing, about a God that you worship? Are you praying to a deity? But we know it's a national ritual to show our patriotism, our love for our country. For Native Americans, these type of ceremonies function in the same way. So a cultural thing like a smudging or a prayer in the four directions isn't necessarily seen as religious. Depending on the context, it's seen as just as much a patriotic thing, showing that you're proud of your cultural heritage. So having an indigenous elder there to do a welcoming ritual, I'm sure everyone involved on the Canadian government's end saw this as a positive thing, never imagined anything bad could come from it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a world of kindness, in a world of good people looking for the best in others, it would have been a non-issue. But we live in a world where people often look for the worst in others and expect the worst in others, especially Pope Francis. This goes back to a principle that I talked about in the Pachamama video, the hermeneutic of charity versus a hermeneutic of suspicion. In an ideal world, if we see something we don't understand, we assume the best. But alas, human nature, especially in the era of social media, is when you see something you don't understand, you assume the worst. And if people see a ceremony, a ritual of some kind that doesn't make sense to them and their culture, they assume it must be evil, that it must be demonic. That's the assumption that people often arrive at anymore. By the way, can you hear me?
Yes.
Any microphone issues?
No, not right now.
Good. So, where was I? Oh, yes.
The hermeneutic of charity. Yeah.
Right. So when you watch an event like this, if you see something you don't understand, you should assume that there's something positive going on unless you have reason to believe otherwise. Or at least at the very least, assume it's something that's not harmful. But when you see a ceremony, a cultural activity you don't understand, we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that it's automatically evil or demonic or anti-Catholic in some way. But a lot of people saw this ceremony and jumped to the worst possible conclusion. And that's how I heard about this. The way it was first revealed to me was there were articles all over Facebook and videos popping up over YouTube that Pope Francis in Canada invoked a demon named the Western Grandmother. I actually saw a video from a major Catholic YouTuber who shall remain nameless, in which the description of the video said, Pope Francis invokes pagan Western Grandmother. And it was being presented that there's this demon called the Western Grandmother, and that Pope Francis participated in a ceremony worshiping the Western Grandmother. And people were calling this Pachamama 2.0. Now, as we talked about before, I'm not an expert on indigenous religions, but I teach world religions. I know enough about it. And I know that indigenous religions in Canada, for example, are generally animistic. So let's say this person was not Catholic. Let's say this person was a practitioner of a pre-Christian indigenous religion.
Yeah.
Even then, he wouldn't be worshiping a deity called the Western Grandmother. He wouldn't be. I actually started hunting for Western Grandmother, in indigenous religions. I could find nothing. Now, the French term for it would be, again, excuse my pronunciation, like Grand-Mère Louise, something like that. But or Louis, I forget. But it's I looked up the French term for this. The only thing that would come up were actually articles from LifeSite News that were translated into French. That was it. There was nothing anywhere in any indigenous religion talking about this. So again, this didn't make a lot of sense to me until I actually watched the video and saw what was going on. So that probably brings us to the video at this point. So I will have it loaded up here. Just give me a second. I will have it on the screen.
Sure, no problem. And while we're doing that, y'all go ahead and share this on your social media. Let's get as many people as we can to be aware of the correct information, since so much misinformation is out there on this topic.
Just give me a second here.
Sure, no problem. And let me also...
Okay, I got it. I'm ready.
Okay, yeah.
All right, can you get on the screen now?
I don't see it yet.
How do I do this? Remind me.
Go to share screen or share at the bottom.
Oh, where it says present?
Yeah, present. And then you'll share screen. You'll select your screen and make sure to hit enable audio. There we go.
Is it on the screen?
I see it now. Yes.
All right. And all right, then the audio. Let me try playing and see if there's any audio. Are you hearing it?
No, I don't hear anything. Try discontinuing it, like
Okay.
and then do it one more time, but at the bottom left, when you go to share screen, bottom left, it should say share audio, share system audio, something like that.
All right, give me a second here.
Mm-hmm. See some questions in the chat. Y'all hold off on the questions at the moment. We'll answer those at the end. If you put them in now, we'll probably forget about them. So, okay, I
Is
can
there
hear
audio
it now.
now?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to jump to the relevant part here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of preparation stuff here,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll start right about here. Right there's good.
Okay.
All right, so they're getting prepared. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
So there we see in the two main seats, there's Pope Francis, and next to him is Mary Simon, who again is the Governor General of Canada representing the Queen. Now, this lady here is speaking on behalf of the Governor General.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to see that she goes back and forth between French and English.
Mm-hmm.
Here's why this is important. When this event was put together, people were not well informed about what was going to take place. So there were translators on the scene for various organizations, apparently. And the translators weren't quite sure if everyone was going to continue going this way, if there was going to be, English, French, or if there's going to be just straight French for a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So the translators had to wing it. The only thing that translators had in front of them were some of the prepared speeches from Pope Francis, perhaps from Justin Trudeau.
Mm-hmm.
They had those in front of them. But when the Native American elder comes on, they didn't have anything that he said in front of them. And they weren't quite sure if he was going to go back and forth between French and English.
Mm-hmm.
So they wait a bit to begin translating, just so you're aware of that.
Okay.
Now, here's where I want to give a shout out to translators. Anyone who studied a foreign language knows that translation is not an exact science. There's an old Italian saying that when you translate, you betray.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you translate, you have to make judgment calls. Very often there are expressions, figures of speech that have no exact equivalent. So you have to stretch for something that's close.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So in this situation, the translators were winging it. They had no idea what the elder was going to say. They knew he was going to do a prayer of some kind, and we find out it's a prayer in the four directions. But even then, there's no script for that, and he kind of improvises as he goes along. It's a very improvised prayer.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, here's where this is significant. There are a few different videos of this event from different organizations. There are at least two different translators, and the translators come to different conclusions on what to say. The version that most people saw, the one that was very popular on the YouTube channels that I've seen, is the version that it was broadcast on the Canadian Public Access Channel, CPAC.
Mm-hmm.
And they have, the French dialogue, and they have an English interpreter who's trying to interpret what's being said. But again, she's winging it, right? This is a live event. There was no script for what was going to be said by the elder. She's winging it the best she can. That's the version that most people saw. I'm showing a different version. This is the version from the Vatican News.
Okay.
So Vatican News is, run by the Vatican, and they have their own translator translating the French. Most people haven't seen this version, so I'm going to show this version.
Okay.
You're following?
Yep.
So we're going to see this lady going back and forth from French to English. And again, I want to emphasize this is an official state event. The Catholic Church had nothing to do with this. The Pope is simply a guest. There was no church involvement in this whatsoever.
Okay.
Simon et Monsieur Whit Fraser, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette cérémonie. On behalf of Their Excellencies, the Right Honorable Barry Simon and Mr. Whit Fraser, I welcome you to this ceremony. Just prior to the beginning of the ceremony, a traditional Inuit lamp, known as the kulik, was lit to mark this important day. Traditionally, the kulik was lit by Inuit women to bring warmth and light to their home. Today, we are grateful for Olipika Rebecca Vivi from Nunavut, who will tend the kulik throughout the ceremony.
So I'm going to comment on that. We're going to see a picture of her later. So in the Inuit tradition, every home would have a special lamp. And the lamp isn't necessarily of religious significance. What it is about, though, is showing that this is a home, a place of warmth. The women would be the one who would take care of it. And it was seen as the source of heat in the home. It would dry wet clothing. It provided light in the darkness. So the fact that women were seen as the heart of the family, so to speak, is why they had this role. So they have that going on here. There's an Inuit lamp that's lit. And again, this is of significance, especially because the Governor General herself is Inuit.
Okay.
You're following okay?
Yes.
All right. So let's see what happens next.
Nous allumons le kulik, la lampe traditionnelle inuite, lors d'événements importants comme la cérémonie d'aujourd'hui. Cette lampe est utilisée dans le Nord pour apporter lumière et chaleur à la demeure.
And there's the Inuit woman with the lamp.
Okay.
Nakurmik.
And again, this is something that is completely harmless. There's nothing, spiritual about this. It's a tradition, it's a custom. But again, for somebody who's not prepared, they could assume the worst.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they did.
Pour commencer, j'aimerais inviter l'aîné Raymond Gros-Louis de la Première Nation Huron-Wendat à prononcer des mots de bienvenue. I would like to invite Elder Raymond Gros-Louis of the Huron-Wendat First Nations to offer words of welcome.
On va rester assis. Par contre, je vais vous demander quelque chose.
So here we have the elder speaking. Now, it takes a while for the translation to kick in because the translator wasn't sure if he was going to switch back and forth like the previous speaker did. When it becomes clear he's only speaking in French, at that point she begins translating. But what he says initially is that he's not doing a traditional smudging. Apparently he was told not to burn anything. So he instead is going to present Pope Francis with some of the things that might be used for a smudge. And then he talks about, he says his name in his native language, and he says for him it's an accomplishment that he can say his name in his native language because he only recently learned it in the past few years because his native language was, kind of buried for a long time because of the residential school system.
Quelque chose de spécial. Vous savez, avec la pandémie qui s'est passée, il y a beaucoup de choses qui ont changé dans nos cérémonies et on n'a pas eu le choix de s'adapter. Et
so you're going to see he presents the Pope with several items, and I'll explain what those are.
j'aimerais ça que quand je vais commencer à allumer la sauge et faire mon lien avec les 4 directions. Et avant, je vais aller porter au pape François un foin d'odeur et une plume de dinde sauvage qui est un animal de survie pour les Wendat sur le territoire. Donc, je vais remettre cette plume et ce foin d'odeur. Le foin d'odeur, c'est... il va servir le pape pour la... Il va purifier par l'odorat. Donc, je sais que le pape François a un peu de misère avec la fumée. Donc, on a beaucoup de façons de faire une cérémonie et de s'adapter. Et je pense que c'est important que le pape François reçoive ce foin d'odeur-là et cette plume-là pour participer en même temps au smudge aux 4 directions. Avant, je vais me présenter en Wendat et quoi aweti noencio, oniontero, chiati andisha wenandui, chiati le mongolui, chiati anaharisqua, Wendat ndi wanda ke indari. Ça fait pas longtemps que j'ai réappris ma langue. Je ne le sais pas au complet, mais le vlog de me présenter, pour moi, c'est beaucoup. Parce que quand que je me présente en ma langue, je parle pas juste à mon nom, mais au nom de tout.
In case there is no translation later, this indigenous leader is offering feathers to the Holy Father, which represent the four dimensions, north, east, south, and west. And he also spoke about how he has only recently relearned his native language.
So what he is doing is he gives Pope Francis an eagle feather. Now, giving someone an eagle feather is considered a sign of great honor, and that's because the eagle is seen as flying closest to God. You there, Michael?
Yes.
Okay, so the eagle, and again, different indigenous cultures interpret this differently, but I'm kind of generalizing here. In Canadian indigenous religions, typically the eagle is seen as insignificant because it flies high in the sky closest to God. So giving somebody an eagle feather is seen as a way of honoring them for bravery, courage, and goodness. So this is considered a huge honor, being given an eagle feather by an elder.
Okay.
Makes sense?
Okay.
He also presents Pope Francis with with sweetgrass, not sage, but sweetgrass. If they were done the smudging like he wanted to do, what would have happened was they would have burned the sweetgrass, and he would have used the eagle feather to fan it as a way of spreading it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. So if things had gone as the elder had wanted, he would have been burning the sweetgrass and then using the eagle feather to fan it, and then he was going to present the Pope with the eagle feather. But because he was told by the government people not to burn anything, what he did was he went and he gave the Pope the stuff that would be used for the smudge as a present. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Also, you're going to see he brings out a bone whistle. And I'm not clear where it came from. It probably came from an eagle. Now, in many indigenous cultures, a bone whistle is a part of rituals. It's a way of making music, a way of expressing a joyful sound. It can also be used as a way of showing honor for elders. So sometimes they'll blow a bone whistle as a way of showing honor to an elder person. Make sense?
Okay.
And this is a very important feather, he says, for our nation. And this, he says, smells very good.
That's the sweetgrass. It smells very good. Following?
Yep.
And he asks that they be brought out together at the same time.
And by being brought out together at the same time, he's referring to them being used together, if there was a smudge. Again, the translator has nothing in front of her to work with. She's winging it. But this is, again, the translator for Vatican News. And now the Pope handed him something. Did you see that?
Yeah, some red thing.
Yeah, it's a box with a rosary. He gave him a rosary as a gift.
Okay. Okay.
So it's an exchange of gift between elders.
Mm-hmm.
And the Holy Father also gave the indigenous leader a gift, although we do not know what it was.
Et on va faire un cercle virtuel.
A rosary.
Vous savez, avec la pandémie, via les petits vidéos.
So now what would have been the smudging is over. Now he's going to do the prayer in the four directions. Now let me explain what that's all about.
Okay.
So in indigenous cultures, everything is seen as circular. You know, circles have a lot of significance. Remember we talked about that when we discussed the Pachamama, you know, the why the people from the Amazon gathered in a circle to pray?
Yeah.
So in a sense, you're making a circle with the prayer in the four directions, but it also looks at the circular nature of life. So look at it this way. In traditional indigenous cultures, everything follows the sun. In other words, the movement of the sun dictates what you're doing during that time of the day. So in the morning, the sun rises in the east. Then the sun travels across the south. And then the sun goes down in the west, but it never shines in the north. Now that orders their entire day traditionally and indigenous cultures. So for that reason, this ritual of praying in the four directions is meant to be a way of sanctifying time. It's meant to be a prayer addressed to the Creator, sanctifying time. It's not a prayer to the directions. Some people describe them as being a prayer to the directions as if the directions are spirits that are being worshipped.
Mm-hmm.
Native Americans do not worship the directions as spirits, but they face in the directions as a way of sanctifying time as they move through that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you said you did mention something about God there. And
Right.
I thought they don't believe in a God.
Well, traditionally, indigenous religions do not, but some of the Native American religions believed in a creator, a great spirit who created all things.
I see. Okay.
So while they wouldn't be considered theistic in the traditional sense, there was a belief in a great spirit of some kind. And when the Catholic missionaries arrived, they, much like St. Paul, to the Athenians,
Mm-hmm.
said, this is your unknown God, right? This is the great spirit.
Right.
So they do dedicate the day to the great spirit by praying in the four directions. And each of the directions is associated with something. Now, this can vary from tribe to tribe. There's no uniform way of doing this. But one fairly common thing you see is that the West is usually associated with grandmothers. It's seen as the direction of the elders. Now, this elder, does things a little bit differently than I've ever heard before. He kind of interjects his own little commentary. You'll see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Là qu'on se sert, je m'étais aperçu que même si on n'est pas en présentiel, on peut faire des choses à partir de l'esprit. Et on va ouvrir un cercle ici aujourd'hui à partir de l'esprit. Et à partir de ce cercle, on va visualiser un feu sacré. Parce que le feu sacré unit tout ce qui existe dans la création.
The sacred fire unites all members of creation.
All right. I'm going to address the sacred fire first.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Huron tradition and in many indigenous traditions, they talk about what's called the sacred fire. What the sacred fire is, it's symbolic of the fire that illuminates the path to the Creator. So they talk about a sacred fire as being this almost like force that shows the way to God. It lights up the darkness. Okay?
Okay. All right.
Et en même temps, on va honorer les 4 éléments vitaux, l'eau, le feu, l'air, la terre.
And we are now honoring water, fire, earth,
minéral, végétal
and wind.
et humain.
So at this point, he lights a sacred fire. Again, it's meant to symbolically show that it's illuminating the way to God. And then he's honoring, earth, fire, water, rock, plants. They call it the vegetable, but plants. Basically, they're honoring all forms of life. It's a way of showing that all life comes from the Creator and all life is sacred.
Okay.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, they're not praying to specific deities here. He's just showing that they honor all of creation because creation comes from the Creator. That would be a typical Catholic interpretation of this among Catholic Native Americans. Now, this fellow here, I have no idea what his religion is. He could be Catholic. He could be trying to practice the old pre-Christian religion. I have no idea. I couldn't tell. Among the Huron-Wendat people, they are overwhelmingly Catholic. And they tend to be very, very faithful Catholics. Like their churches are overflowing with Catholic Native Americans there. He could be Catholic. He could not be. I don't know. But I'm just saying this ritual, the way he's carrying it out, could be done in a way by Catholics that's completely in harmony with Catholic belief.
Okay.
And every state, human, vegetable.
Je vais demander à la direction de l'Est d'ouvrir sa porte pour qu'on puisse avoir accès à cette direction. Je vais demander à la direction du Sud d'ouvrir sa porte.
He is asking that each direction, north, open its doors so that we may have access to it. South may open its doors so we have access to it. West, is being honored as the direction for grandmothers, and north as the direction of grandfathers.
Now, again, he's using anthropomorphic language to describe the directions. He's not worshiping spirits, but they talk about the directions in anthropomorphic language. That's very common in these traditions, to talk about all things in ways that are anthropomorphic.
Okay.
Parce qu'ils sont une minorité dans une minorité.
And a special door for the Inuits, who are a minority within a minority.
He's giving a shout out to the Inuits, again, because they're represented there with the lamp. And again, the Governor General is Inuit.
Tant qu'elle a commencé avec le Kulik, que je connais aussi. Donc, c'est un honneur d'avoir les Inuits et d'avoir cette culture-là aussi en même temps.
It is also an honor to have the Inuits and their culture among us.
Les 4 directions, je vais prendre mon sifflet 4 fois. C'est un os de dinde sauvage que j'ai eu.
And he is going to blow into his whistle, which is made out of a bone, 4 times to represent these 4 directions. He asks that we each place our hands on our hearts.
Le cœur, ça peut servir de bâton de parole en même temps. Mais c'est là que le Créateur a mis la sagesse aux humains.
The heart is what gives wisdom to humankind.
Ce geste
All right, so you notice that Pope Francis goes along with it. He puts his hand on his heart. That's the extent of his participation in this ritual, is putting his hand on his heart. And again, there's nothing harmful here, right? There's nothing here that's against Christianity. That being said, the Vatican would have stopped this from happening if they knew it was going to happen. Father Christina would not have allowed this to happen, because this is the kind of thing that requires catechesis in advance.
Okay.
It's easily misinterpreted. If you know what's going on, it's perfectly fine, but it's easily misinterpreted.
Yeah.
de justement aller se connecter à cette sagesse-là.
And it is important that we connect with the wisdom that it gives us.
Je demande à la grand-mère de l'Ouest de nous rendre accès au grand cercle sacré en haut des esprits.
He asks that the West gives us access to the great circles above.
Et plus fort ensemble. Tiens, ouais.
Together we are stronger, he says.
Tiens, ouais, grand-père, grand-père François. En haut. Merci.
And directs the salutation to the Holy Father.
Thank you. Merci. Aidez-nous.
Yeah,
So
you're okay. I can hear you now.
I muted by accident there.
Okay,
That was me
now the world of circles above. What's going on there?
muting. Right. So he asks that the West gives access to the circles above. So he talked before anthropomorphically about the different directions and how they should open their doors, right?
Mhm.
So what he's talking about is how each direction represents something special. The West represents grandmothers and their wisdom. So he's talking about the West giving access to the circles above. The other translation that went out there is the circle of spirits, or the sacred circle of spirits. That's the translation from the CPAC version. If you look at the actual French text, it can be interpreted in different ways. Sacred circle of spirits would be a very literal translation, but it could also be a figure of speech for above, right? So what is this? If you search for it, there's nothing clear. Again, this elder was kind of improvising, as you saw. More than likely, what he's referring to is the connection with those who've passed, the ancestors. So in these cultures, a spiritual connection to your ancestors is very important. That's seen as a very crucial thing. And the idea is that the ancestors, are part of almost like a heavenly council, often is seen as a circle. So my guess would be he's talking about the circle of ancestors, and it could be looked at like this. So the West, the wisdom of the grandmothers opens the door for us to connect with the wisdom of those who've come before us. That's one possible way of interpreting it. There could be other ways, though. The fact of the matter is, it's not clear what he means, but the best possible interpretation would be he's talking about connecting with ancestors, and the circles above could be seen as a type of reference to heaven or something like heaven.
Yeah, the English translation that I listened to used circle of spirits, and it made it sound a little different than what
Right.
you're indicating there. It's like, wait, what are you doing? Are you opening yourself up to the demonic here? What's taking place?
So the translators, this guy is going on the fly, right? He's winging it. The translators are winging it. They're doing the best they can with what's being thrown at them at that moment. So this translator translates it as the circles above, again, the heavenly circle. The other translator says the sacred circle of spirits. It could mean the same thing, right? It could mean the same thing. It's just a different way of translating it.
Yeah, but to a Catholic who's not really aware of Native American culture, it's gonna sound like they're opening themselves up to the demonic if you put it in the latter way.
Right, absolutely. And again, that's why the Vatican and why Father Cristino did not want something like this to happen, because it requires catechesis in advance.
Yeah.
Father Cristino said in one of his interviews that it can be very destructive to put on display a ritual where there's no opportunity to explain it.
Yeah.
And that's what happened here. There's a ritual with no opportunity to explain it.
Which is what happened with the Pachamama ceremony, although I think they would have had the opportunity there, but they didn't. So I think it sounds like they learned from that mistake and wanted to avoid repeating it.
Yes, that's exactly what they're trying to avoid. They did everything in their power to avoid it, and this was a curveball they didn't see coming.
Yeah.
And again, to the Canadian government, this seemed like a nice welcome. The woman, the host, the Governor General, is herself indigenous. To her, this is how her people welcome people to their homes. So she thinks they're doing something nice. And honestly, the Pope probably figures this is nice enough.
Sure.
There's no reason to believe anything insidious is going on here. No one's inviting demonic possession.
Yeah.
You probably noticed that somebody was missing.
Who?
Western Grandma.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, because the version that I listened to did specifically say Western Grandma. I'm like, what is this? And I jokingly and laughingly said, well, who would that be? Saint Anne?
This version is missing Western Grandma. Where in the world is Western Grandma? Let me clarify this for you. So again, both translators are winging it. They're doing the best they can with an impromptu situation.
Yeah.
So this lady translates it as such. She translates it as, may the West open the door to the heavenly circle, something like that. She doesn't say anything about a Western grandmother. Now, the other version says the Western grandmother give us access to this sacred circle of spirits.
Yeah.
Like I said, my French is very rusty. I took French for reading a long time ago, over 20 years ago at this point in my PhD program. But I can understand enough French when I hear it. So I must have watched different versions of this episode, of this event, from different video sources, at least 4 or 5 different sources I watched. And I cranked up the volume and I listened to what he said over and over and over again. I could not hear Western Grandma. I did not hear Grandmother of the West or Western Grandmother. I did not hear that. I'll tell you what I did hear. He says something of the West, but it's garbled and I can't make out what he's saying.
Okay.
He speaks very quickly. I'm not sure what he's saying. Now, I used the caption generator from Google to generate captions. And what Google came up with was, okay, to be clear, and again, excuse my pronunciation, Grandmother of the West would be Grand-mère de l'Ouest. He says something de l'Ouest, something of the West, but it's not clear what he's saying. What the Google caption generator put as him saying was Gare de l'Ouest, which would mean station of the West. So may the station of the West grant us access, whatever that means. That's Google's interpretation of it. I can't make out what he's saying. The translator for CPAC went with grandmother of the West, probably because he was talking about grandmothers earlier, and grandmothers are associated with the West in their culture. So she probably assumed that's what he was saying, but there's no clear audio and there was no official transcript of any kind. So whether or not Western grandma was evoked here is up for debate. Maybe the grandmother of the West was mentioned and we just can't hear it in the audio. But I did not hear it, and I listened to at least 5 different versions of this video at very loud volumes.
Is there evidence that Western grandma can also refer to Saint Anne?
When I searched and searched and searched, the only grandmother, okay, I couldn't find Western grandmother, but when I started searching for grandmother and Huron-Wendat is the nation he's from, all that came up was a reference after reference after reference to Saint Anne. And when you look up sacred grandmother, Huron, or grandmother, holy grandmother of the indigenous peoples of Canada, everything is Saint Anne.
Okay.
So it's possible it was a reference to Saint Anne. It may have been, it may have not have been. It's hard to say. But let's put ourselves in that room for the moment.
Yeah.
Let's pretend we're the Holy Father or one of the Catholic bishops there, part of the Pope's entourage. And this guy does clearly evoke in French the Western grandmother. Given the fact that the whole event has been about Saint Anne, the Feast of Saint Anne was the day before, I believe, and the next morning you're heading to the shrine of Saint Anne, your assumption probably would be that he's talking about Saint Anne. Even if that's incorrect, that probably would be your assumption.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So that's the event there. Again, the Holy Father was a guest of the Canadian government, a guest of an Indigenous Governor General. This fellow gave a nice welcome, gave him a present. From the Holy Father's perspective, this is not that unusual. What was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to stand up and denounce the event as heresy? He's there as head of state.
Yeah.
Does he want to create an international incident? Should he stand up and say, I denounce you and your wicked idolatry? I condemn you? I mean, what's he supposed to do? He can't even stand. He's in a wheelchair. He was there as a guest. Something happened that he probably didn't understand, something he was not expecting. No one was expecting that. He was there as a guest. This was a welcome for a guest. How is he supposed to respond? So I say this in all charity to the seemingly hundreds of Catholic YouTubers who condemned this, who condemned the Holy Father for his participation in this. What was he supposed to do?
Yeah, it makes sense whenever you explain that this is in the context of him being greeted as head of state. This wasn't a Catholic liturgy. This wasn't a liturgy of any sorts, and that even the things that he's saying and doing in and of themselves are not like inherently idolatrous or anything like that.
Can you put
helps.
the screen back up to regular again? I'm done sharing.
Yeah. So that's it. There is nothing more to the ceremony.
Well, at that point, he after he thanks the Holy Father, he sits down, and then Justin Trudeau gives a speech.
Yeah,
we don't need to sit through that.
Yeah, but it was turned into a huge deal of Pope Francis engaging in idolatry again, and I felt that's too far. But for me, when I initially saw this, I felt like, well, this is just scandalous in appearance because they're invoking spirits from various circles. What in the world is going on? And so
the language being used, I'm familiar with, is not necessarily spiritual. But it's possible there could be an Indigenous person somewhere using that language, intending to evoke, the spirits of nature or something. That is possible. That's totally possible. The truth of the matter is, I don't know what's going through this man's head. I don't know what, the elder is thinking. I don't know what his intention is, but everything he's saying and doing can certainly be interpreted in a way that's harmonious with Christianity.
What's curious? We just had a couple trolls in the chat. One of them, even after all of this explanation that you just offered, one of them said they can't sit here and watch the video of this because watching the video could cause them to become possessed.
I'm sorry, that's just hilarious.
There's that reaction. Another one was, yeah, one other person was saying, yeah, he should have got up, and some saints were that bold to denounce them for that heresy. What would you say to that?
So let me give you another reaction. This is the reaction from Father Cristino himself. So he had no idea this was happening. He was busy doing a rehearsal at the church. When he's done rehearsing at the church, he goes back to his hotel. He turns on the TV and he sees this. He sees video footage of this, and he is horrified. This was Father Cristino's worst nightmare. This was exactly what he did not want to have happen. Now, Father Cristino himself has participated in ceremonies like this many times, but only when he knows the people conducting it and he knows their intentions. He said in one interview, for example, that if he goes somewhere and there's a smudge and then a prayer, and the prayer is in a language he doesn't understand, or he's not sure what the intention of the leader is, he will not participate. Because he only participates if he knows their intention.
Yeah.
These things can be done with good intentions. They can be done with non-Christian or unchristian intentions.
Yeah.
But, you know, Father Cristino also knows that what happened here can be interpreted in a way that's totally legitimately, you know, in keeping with Catholicism. But this was his worst nightmare because he knew that this would go out before the world with no opportunity to explain it, with no advanced catechesis. And when people see things they don't understand, they tend to assume the worst. That's what happened here. And for the Holy Father, if you see something like this, you don't gather what's going on, you're kind of blindsided by it. Unless there's a reason to assume otherwise, assume that there's nothing nefarious going on.
That makes sense. Yeah, somebody in the chat is saying, and by the way, y'all can send chat questions. Make sure to send them to @Reason and Theology. Somebody's saying, I do wish these instances happen less often. Just feels too easy to scandalize Catholics as a result. But again, keep in mind, this one wasn't one put on by the Catholic Church or anything.
The Catholic Church had nothing to do with this. The Pope was there as a head of state, as a guest. He had nothing to do with it. But the reason it seems like these things are more common is probably because of social media. This type of thing happened all the time with Pope John Paul II, and usually there was no YouTube or Twitter to amplify it.
I do see a couple questions here. Let me grab them. How would you answer objections that sage burning is still occultist or superstitious insofar as it's a non-Christian way of combating evil spirits?
So that's what it was originally. But for most Native Americans today, it's not necessarily seen as that. Especially for the ones who are Catholic, they see it as a way of preparing themselves, of purifying themselves. They don't necessarily see it as having a spiritual significance. It all depends on the intention.
Trying to make sense of this question.
That being said, I do want to add one more thing, though.
Okay.
If you are a Christian and you don't understand what's going on, don't be doing it.
So here's one. Regarding the optics of events like this, what exactly would be the distinction between unintentionally misleading people to unintentionally scandalizing? Which would be worse and why?
I'm not sure what he means. I don't understand the question.
Yeah, so the difference between unintentionally misleading people and unintentionally scandalizing. So what would be the difference between, misleading somebody, but then or versus actually scandalizing them? Because I could see something that unintentionally misleads somebody that isn't scandalous in nature, and then on the other hand, unintentionally misleading people and it does scandalize people. I think that's what he's asking, the distinction between those two, which would be worse and why. I would think the one that does at the end of the day scandalize people is worse. But maybe if you can clarify the question a little bit more, Patrick, that'd be helpful. That was the way I read it, though.
I'm not sure what he means.
Don't some natives use sage as incense, making it anointed by God or blessed like sacramentals?
First of all, there are literally, hundreds of different Native American communities. Some of them can use things in very different ways. My understanding is usually more to do with purification than being offered in the way that incense is offered. But some may interpret it that way. Some may interpret it as, this is something that came from God. You're offering it back to God.
What were some of the reactions that you saw, like specific claims that were made about Pope Francis?
At this event? About this event?
About the event, yeah.
One refrain I saw over and over again is that he participated in the invocation of a demon,
Mhm.
and that in doing so, he was going to bring about another plague, much like the COVID one or worse.
Mm. Okay.
Because there's a narrative going around that the COVID pandemic was caused by the Pachamama event.
I've heard that before. Yeah.
But it's gained a lot of traction. Now, as I showed in the other video, and by the way, viewer, if you haven't seen the other video, look it up. It's worth seeing. As we showed in the other video, there was no Pachamama. Like
Mhm.
Pachamama wasn't even there in the Vatican gardens. There was no image of Pachamama. But in this case, there was no demon called the Western grandmother evoked or invoked. If there was a mention of a Western grandmother, it probably didn't mean that. It probably was a reference to grandmothers being our access to the elders who came before us through their wisdom and their history and their stories.
Mm.
But there was no deity. There's nothing worshipped in the Huron-Wendat culture called the Western grandmother. So no Western grandmother was invoked.
How would one use sage to cleanse oneself, but without this being a cleansing of any spiritual significance?
All right, so let's put ourselves back even a century ago, before indoor plumbing was a thing, before frequent bathing was a thing. You're having company over, or you're going somewhere important. Do you want to stink or do you want to smell good?
Mhm. Mhm.
Burning things like sage and sweetgrass has the very practical effect of making a place smell good or making a person smell good. So because it gets rid of bad odors and makes you smell better, there's a symbolism that you're preparing yourself, not just externally, but internally as well.
Was there a diplomatic option for Pope Francis to excuse himself from all this to avoid confusion, or it's impossible?
Well, once it began, I'm not sure how to get out of there. First of all, he needs somebody to push him in his wheelchair.
Mhm.
And if all he was told, I mean, if we go back and watch the video, the words that actually come out of the lady's mouth when she introduces the elder, and this is an exact quote, she says this in English. She says the elder is invited to give words of welcome. That's how she introduces him. The elder is there to give words of welcome. So as far as Pope Francis knows, he's going to give words of welcome.
But they didn't really say beyond that what he would be
No,
participating
and he was blindsided. He had no idea that was going to happen.
Yeah.
And even when it happened, I don't think it bothered him because he understood it was just a welcoming. It was just a way of saying welcome.
Now, John is saying if this had been a mass, the implications would be totally different. I don't feel scandalized by this as the state visit it was. Now, if it had been a mass, would this have been an issue?
So Father Cristino, who I'm going to go to the authority on this, does not like seeing this done in mass because he feels that you're imposing a meaning onto the ritual that may not necessarily be there naturally. So sometimes there have been Catholic masses where they've used this purification ritual perhaps in place of a penance ritual, or perhaps it's being used as a way of offering incense. But he feels that in most cases, depending on the culture, but in most cases, that's imposing a meaning onto it that does not belong inherently in the ritual itself. I tend to think that it should not be part of a Catholic mass unless it's part of the culture in which it's taking place and the people there understand what's going on.
Somebody has a comment here. This just seems like the Pope seems to do a lot of questionable things without asking questions. Should he have asked questions?
It happened. I mean, he didn't know it was going to happen. It happened. You know, it's almost like if you go to a restaurant and you're there having dinner, and then somebody walks in and starts doing a musical number, you know, maybe one of those like flash raves or something happens, right? If there's a flash mob in the food court, you're there eating dinner and there's a flash mob in the food court, you're sitting there, you're not sure what to do. And at one point they say, put your hands in the air. And okay, right? This is the equivalent of that. There's no time to ask questions. It just happened and you're there.
Richard says, could not the Pope say something like Christ is King and remove all doubt?
Well, he does give a speech after this in which he talks very strongly about Christ and about our Lord, and he talks about Mary and Saint Anne. He gives and the full speech is part of the video. The transcript of the speech is out there, and he essentially does say Christ is king. So yeah, he did that.
At the event itself.
At the event itself, if you read the text of his speech, it's a
Mhm.
Christian speech. You know, it's a speech of reconciliation, but it's also a speech that's very Christian, honoring the Lord.
Let's see. I think we grabbed all the questions. Just double checking here. Yeah, I think that's all of them. Any final comments that you wanted to include in there? Anything that maybe we missed that we should address?
The main thing is this. We need to always approach things with a hermeneutic of charity.
Mhm.
I think there's a whole cottage industry out there of people who want to bring down Pope Francis, and of people who want to portray him in the worst light possible. And maybe they have their reasons. I understand his restrictions on the Latin Mass have angered a lot of people. One can question the prudence of that, and I think one can legitimately criticize him for that. But at the same time, all criticism should be based in truth. We need to know what's really taking place before we jump to a conclusion. We need to know what's really going through his mind, what's really taking place in the event before we assume that he's engaging in demonic worship of some kind. But like I said, there's a cottage industry of people who are getting a lot of YouTube views off of these type of scandals. And there are people who are getting a lot of mileage out of this type of thing. And I think they're keeping it alive. But I would ask those people, those major YouTubers, those writers with websites, LifeSite News, I would ask them to look at their hearts and ask themselves, are you pursuing truth? Just jumping to a conclusion based on what you see without knowing the facts may not be doing justice to the Holy Father. At the very least, he is a fellow Christian. We deserve to treat him with enough respect as to give him the benefit of the doubt and to look for the truth in any situation rather than assuming the worst.
You know, at the very least, just come out and offer an apology and say, "Hey, I was wrong," or you know, something like that, and correct the misinformation. It's just like, I can understand some people being confused with some of the mistranslations and not knowing the context and stuff like that. I can understand. I was myself confused, but you want to, at the end of the day, once you discover the truth, to then spread the truth, just as you would, spread the confusion. So spread the truth as well.
Especially if you are presenting yourself as being a Catholic apologist
Mhm.
or a Catholic news site, I think
Mhm.
you have an obligation
To
to
correct it, yeah.
to search for truth and to present truth and to admit when you're wrong. Because remember this, Satan is the father of lies.
Yeah, and that's partly why I wanted you to come on, because I realized there's more to this than I realized initially, and I want to correct some of those things from my initial evaluation. And so that's why I brought you on, because you're in a much better position to do that than I am.
And
with
the good
giving
news,
your
by the way,
expertise.
is that it does appear very strongly that the Holy See learned from the Pachamama debacle.
Yeah, that's what was interesting to me, is that they wanted to avoid this. I thought, "Well, okay, that's interesting." I think that they still could do better by coming out now and saying, "Hey, let's set the record straight on this Pachamama issue. That video that Father Deacon Dragani did in the US, he's right. You know, come out and actually just say that, you know?"
Yeah. Like I said, I think Pope Francis has a general policy of not engaging critics.
Mhm.
With regard to this particular scandal, though, with the Canada visit and the so-called Western grandmother,
Mhm.
um, from my research into this, I think this was mostly just a scandal among English-speaking North Americans.
Mhm.
I think people who heard it in the native French were not scandalized by it the same way that we were. And it appeared to me that this got very little traction in Europe.
Here's something. Why, and it's related to what you just said. Why didn't the Pope come out and say this was an idolatry, or that if there was any idolatry, he rejects it?
So things that seem like huge scandals to us, those of us who are on social media, those of us who are watching YouTube constantly, major scandals to us probably don't even register for most of the world.
Mhm.
And in this case, I don't think that the negative reaction was even on the Vatican's radar for this.
Mhm. Um, One more here. Not sure if this was a flash mob. Doesn't a head of state visit require a thoroughly reviewed itinerary? I don't think if Joe Biden visits somewhere, there are a bunch of surprises. So in other words, why doesn't Pope Francis have an itinerary? Any guesses on that one?
I imagine he was, and probably the itinerary said, welcome from native elder, and then it said speech by Justin Trudeau.
Mhm.
You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
That's
Sure.
probably what the itinerary said. Welcome from native elder.
Yeah. Yeah. But just didn't really go into a whole lot of details on it. Yeah. Alma says, I'm so glad for this video and for the information. Yeah, there was a lot of positive comments. A lot of people already in the chat were really benefiting from this, and it explained and clarified a whole lot of things for them, including myself. I mean, I appreciate it. Every time you come on, I learn something. And so you have a very valuable insight in these areas. I truly appreciate it.
I appreciate you giving me an avenue to share this, because this is one of those things, just like with Pachamama, where when it happened, I'm pulling my hair out. What hair I have, I don't have much hair left, but I'm pulling my hair out saying, guys, you're misinterpreting this. And very few people wanted to hear what I had to say. Once again, I had people getting angry at me for saying that the Pope did not invoke a demon.
You know, what's really sad though is that I just, even though a lot of these videos that you've done have clarified so many things, people still continue with the narrative. I'm not going to name names here, but I could think of one group who put out falsehoods about the Pachamama thing, and then when they saw your video and was confronted by the truth and the other side of the story, still refused to believe anything other than it was idolatry. And so
yeah,
it's truly sad at the end of the day that people aren't correcting this stuff once they're confronted with the truth and confronted with a better interpretation of these things.
There are narratives out there that people want to believe in. They want to believe certain narratives, and the truth sadly falls by the wayside. But again, remember, the truth is with God.
Yeah, I think Jay Pranobis said it well right here. The truth does not bring clicks.
It doesn't. What brings clicks is the ancient aliens. That brings clicks.
You're right about that. That's why the History Channel doesn't have history anymore. They have ancient alien theories.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Because if they actually showed some history on the History Channel, people wouldn't watch,
Viewership would plummet.
Yeah, it would. Anyways, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. Always an honor to have you on.
My pleasure, Michael. I really enjoyed this.
Everybody, please share this on your social media. Help spread the word. I mean, so many people are shouting out lies and falsehoods. Let's do our best to try to offset this by putting out the truth. So again, share this on your social media, your Facebook, your Twitter, whatever, Instagram, whatever platform you can share it on, please share it. And of course, hit the like button and the subscribe button, and check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology, if you want to support what we're doing here. That's going to do it. We'll see you later. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the